na úvod by som rád predstavil speakera dnešného, ktorým je otec Edmund Waldstein. A teraz... So, now I'll switch to English because this event will be taking place and will not be translated, so it will be only held in English. So let me introduce Father Edmund Waldstein, who is he has come from Heiligenkreuz. It's a Cistercian monastery, and he is a Cistercian monk. He took vows in 2010 to be a monk and also to be ordained as a priest in 2011. Am I correct? Good. Okay, thanks. Some very interesting facts at the beginning. He's part of a very important, or shall we say, important family, a noble family who goes a long way back to the 30 Years' War, because his relative or his ancestor, he was a Count of Waldstein, and he took part in the 30 Years' War as a general. He later became a prince. Father Edmund Waldstein is a very academically skilled person or studied person. He studied in theology. He's now a doctorate student, and he also participates in numerous public discussions. Also, he's an active blogger. Is it true? Okay. Okay. Very also for me an interesting fact is that he comes from a very let's say a large family. He's with numerous kids, and he was homeschooled, and his mother also supported us, or she held a lecture here about homeschooling previously. So now he's going to talk about ex-hosted democracy. I'm also very interested in this topic, fascinated because I have never heard about this before, and now I'm going to hand over to him so he can have his lecture.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. And my mother told me to send her greetings to everyone who remembers her when she was here. I've been told, Boris was telling me right before my lecture, that this building, the Pistori Palace, is closely associated with the disastrous political ideologies of the last century. So during the Second World War, it housed the representatives of National Socialist Germany, and then after the war, it became a Lenin museum, as some of you perhaps remember. This evening, I'm going to be criticizing an aspect of the dominant political ideology of our own time. I call this ideology that dominates our own time liberalism. And the history of liberalism in the last century or so is a history of a great triumph. At the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of people were doubtful about this ideology, but then after the experience of the world wars, after it triumphed over totalitarianism, and then after the fall of totalitarian communism here and in other parts of Europe, liberalism triumphs as the only major political ideology left, at least here in the West. it's triumphed so much that it's like the air we breathe. We don't even notice that it's around us. So that many of the doctrines of liberalism seem to us just obvious truths, truisms, self-evident. And today I'm going to look at one example of such a doctrine of liberalism that seems to most people today to be obvious, namely that democracy is the best form of government. I think that most people today think that this is true. In fact, many people think even more that it's the only reasonable, the only legitimate form of government. It's become democracy. The word democracy now is almost a synonym for legitimate government, for the rule of law. Undemocratic has become a synonym for tyrannical, for a regime that's not concerned with the good of the people. And even those who are tired of democracy, who are fed up with the hypocrisy and vulgarity and pettiness of democratic politics, with their short-sightedness and divisiveness, and so on, even people who are tired of this, they can't conceive of an alternative. So, for example, we had in the past couple of years in the United States and then spreading to other parts of the world, the Occupy movement, beginning with Occupy Wall Street, right? And these are people who, the people in Occupy Wall Street, they're fed up with the democratic process and with the way in which representatives who are supposed to serve the interests of the people actually serve this so-called 1%, upon whom they're financially dependent. But they don't propose something else other than democracy as the solution. They just try to propose another form of democracy. They don't dare to state what seems to be the obvious implication of their criticism of the status quo, namely that democracy itself is a problem. And on a completely different different part of the ideological map, as it were, you have people like Vladimir Putin in Russia, right? Who obviously doesn't have any real devotion to democracy. He's fed up with the chaos of democracy in the Yeltsin years in Russia and the way in which it damaged and spectacularly weakened Russian power and Russian prestige. But yet, despite his evident contempt for democracy, he doesn't dare to come out and say it, but he has to pretend that he's democratic, and go through these sort of democratic rituals of having people vote for him and stuff like this. And when he annexes the Crimea, they have to have a referendum, to legitimize this and so on. So this idea that democracy is the only legitimate form of government is so dominant that even people who don't believe it have to pretend that they do. But this was not always the case. If you go back to classical antiquity, to ancient Greece, you see the greatest philosophers of ancient Greece considered the greatest philosophers being Aristotle and Plato. They considered democracy to be a rather inferior form of political life. So Plato has Socrates, his teacher, claim that democratic citizens are dominated by passion, by licentious passion, rather than by reason. And I quote here Socrates from the Republic. He says, "They call insolence good education, anarchy freedom, wastefulness magnificence, and shamelessness courage." And Socrates says in the Republic, that the democratic regime is the sort of regime that is favored by women and children, which, according to the Platonic philosophy, are people in whom reason is weak. So, my apologies to the ladies. This is Plato speaking here, not me. And Aristotle, Plato's greatest pupil, and the greatest of all ancient philosophers, distinguishes between different forms of government. He distinguishes, on the one hand, good forms of government, where the rulers act for the common good of the city, and bad forms of government in which the rulers rule for their own private interests. And he gives the name democracy to one of the bad forms of government, namely the one where the poor rule the city for their interest, against the interest of the rest of the city. In the Christian Middle Ages, the most common form of government was not democratic, but monarchical. And many of the greatest medieval thinkers thought that this was perfectly reasonable. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, the great transformation that brought the modern world into being began to change this, but this change took many centuries, and many people resisted this change, especially Catholics. So when the revolutionaries killed King Louis XVI of France, Pope Pius VI commented as follows, and now I quote a long quote from Pope Pius VI. This is from an allocution to a consistory of the Sacred College of Cardinals. Pope Pius VI. The most Christian king, Louis XVI, was condemned to death by an impious conspiracy, and this judgment was carried out. We shall recall to you in a few words the ordering and motives of this sentence. The National Convention had no right or authority to pronounce it. After abolishing the monarchy, the best form of government, it had transferred the civil power in its entirety to the people, which acts neither by reason nor by good counsel, which does not conform itself in any way to just ideas, which evaluates few matters in accordance with truth and a great number in accordance with opinion, which is always inconsistent, can easily be deceived and drawn to every excess, and is ungrateful, arrogant, and cruel, which rejoices in slaughter and in the shedding of human blood, and draws pleasure from watching the sufferings which precede the last breath, just as men in former times used to watch gladiators die in the ancient amphitheaters. Thus, Pope Pius VI. And at the time of Pope Pius VI in the 18th century, this was not an unusual opinion. I want to try to explain why it is that today most people think about democracy and monarchy so differently from Pope Pius VI. First, I'll look at the view of politics that one gets in the greatest thinkers of the Middle Ages, the synthesis of ancient philosophy and Christian faith that you have in them, and the view of politics that it gives them. I then want to explain a little bit how the great change came about and why modernity sees democracy as the best form of government, and how this is connected to the modern rejection of classical philosophy and of the Christian faith. And I'll argue that this modern preference for democracy is unreasonable, and that it flows from a false conception of the end, the goal, the purpose of political life, a false conception of the common good, and a false conception of the source of political authority, of where political authority comes from, what legitimatizes political authority. And then finally, I'll ask whether any practical consequences can be drawn from my position or not. there probably is not going to be a restoration of the monarchy here in Central Europe anytime soon, much as I hope for it. But I think nevertheless there are some practical consequences. One can work towards a more authentic understanding of, and at least partially towards a more authentic realization of the common good. And if one sees through the sort of false self-evidence of liberal politics, then it allows one to gain a kind of critical distance from the ideology of our time that I think is very necessary to resist certain evils. So, the first point is the discarded image, the idea of politics that you get in the high Middle Ages, that comes from the synthesis of Christian faith and classical philosophy. And first, the purpose of government, according to this synthesis. Classical Greek philosophy is deeply marked by the experience of the war between Greece and Persia, the invasion of Greece by the Persian king Xerxes. In Book 7 of the Histories of Herodotus, Herodotus describes how the Greek interpreter Demaratus explains to Xerxes, the Persian tyrant, why it is that although the Persians have a much bigger army, the Greeks are going to win. And Demaratus turns out to be right. The Greeks do win. The Persians lose. This is the reason that Demaratus gives. I quote, "For, though free, yet they are not free in all things. For over them is set law as a master whom they fear, much more even than your people fear you. It is certain at least that they do whatsoever that master commands, and that he commands ever the same thing. That is to say, he bids them not flee out of battle from any multitude of men, but stay in their post and win the victory or lose their life." So the reason why the Greeks win is that unlike the Persians, they're not the slaves of passion. They're not ruled by emotion, by the feeling of the moment, but they are the slaves, as Demaratus says, of law. They are ruled by the law. And the Greek philosophers explain this by saying that to be ruled by law is to be ruled by reason, since law is a decision based on reason, on the highest power of the human soul. And this is the classical Greek notion of freedom. In Greece, you have different competing accounts of freedom, but the one that is given by perennial philosophy, by Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, is this, that freedom is to be ruled by reason. To be ruled by reason is to be free, because it means understanding what is really good, what is really desirable for me, what it is that I should really want. I mean, it's not being moved by the passion of the moment to do something that I really know will lead me away from what's really good for me, that will leave me away from where my true happiness lies, but to stand firm at my post and to do what reason commands, what really leads to the good. And the achievement of what's really good for me is what makes me happy. And everyone wants to be happy. So the law, of which the Greeks are the slaves, as Demaratus says, which forces them to do what's really good, what leads to happiness, doesn't limit their freedom. In fact, it makes them free. It makes them able to achieve what they really want deep down in their souls, what really leads to their happiness. So this conception of freedom presupposes that there is an objective good for man that is knowable by human reason. That human reason is able to know what is really good for us, what will really make us happy, what will fulfill us. So if you've read the dialogues of Plato, you know that Socrates argues a lot with the sophists of his time about this point. They hold that there is no such thing as an objective good, a true good. So Thrasymachus, for example, talking about justice, says, justice is the advantage of the stronger. That is to say, whatever people happen to desire, they call good, and if they have power, then they force everyone to submit to their desire to help them achieve what they want, and they call that justice. If everyone obeys them, it's just, and if people don't obey them, it's not just. So it's just the imposition of power. They randomly choose something they want, and then they achieve it through power. But Socrates argues very convincingly that this is false, that in fact there is an objective good. The good is indeed what we want, it's what we desire, but it is not good because we want it. It's not good because we desire it. It's not because this is what I want, it's good for me, but the other way around. We desire it because it's good. The good awakens the desire in the soul. When we know the good, when we see the good, then it arouses desire in the soul, when we see what's really good for us. So why doesn't everyone desire what's really good for them? You see people all the time, drug addicts desire cocaine, which is going to destroy their lives, you know. Why? If it's true that everyone who sees the good desires it, if desire is the cause, good is the cause of desire. Well, the difficulty, as Plato explains, is that there are different powers of knowing in the human soul. We have the senses, touch and taste and sight and hearing and so on. And then there's reason. And the senses know a limited kind of goodness, right? Taste knows when something is sweet, which is a kind of goodness that's desirable, and so on. But it doesn't. The senses don't understand the good. So from the senses we get certain passions, certain emotions, which lead us towards a limited kind of goodness. But reason is able to understand the good. It's able to see the good and why it's good, what the good really is. And it's able to see the complete good, what really makes me happy. So reason has to order the passions that arise from the senses so that they pursue their particular goods in the right order so that the complete good is achieved. It has to moderate them so they don't go to excess and destroy the person by making him drink too much wine or whatever, but a moderate amount of wine, just to the amount that helps him to live a happy life. And the problem with man is that this order is not given from the start. It's not given by nature, but most men are disordered in their souls. There's kind of a war going on. The passions are striving. They want to go to excess and so on. And reason is weak and is kind of following after them. They're slaves of their passions like the Persian soldiers. So man has to be educated. He has to be trained. His soul has to be ordered so that there's harmony between reason and the passions. And this harmony is called virtue. And the purpose of the law, which is what makes the Greeks free, which rules over the Greeks, is to make them virtuous. The law educates men, orders their passions, commands them to do what is reasonable, and so produces virtue in their soul. Now this harmony in the soul, this order in the soul, is not just a useful good. It's not just something that's good because it helps me to get something else that I want, but this order in the soul is itself something good. And it's a participation in a higher good. A participation is the main theme of Platonic philosophy, you could say. It means having something in a partial way. Not having a piece of something, but having something in a partial way. And so virtue, the order in the soul, is a participation in a higher order, an eternal order. So Socrates says in the Republic, I quote here another long quote, this time from Socrates as reported by Plato in the Republic. He says, "For he whose mind is fixed upon true being, his eye is ever directed towards things fixed and immutable, which he sees, neither injuring nor injured by one another, but all in order, moving according to reason. These he imitates, and to these he will, as far as he can, conform himself. And the philosopher, holding converse with the divine order, becomes orderly and divine, as far as the nature of man allows. And if a necessity be laid upon him of fashioning not only himself, but human nature generally, whether in states or individuals, into that which he beholds, will he, think you, be an unskillful artificer of justice and every civil virtue? And if the world perceives that what we are saying about him is the truth, will they be angry with philosophy? Will they disbelieve us when we tell them that no state can be happy which is not designed by artists who imitate the heavenly pattern?" So I think this is one of the most profound insights of Platonic philosophy, that the human good, human virtue, the order in the human soul, is a participation in a higher good, a divine good. So our good, the human good, my good, exists in my soul, but exists even more in a higher realm. The divine good is more my good than the order in my own soul. Because the order in my soul is only a participation. It's only a partial sharing in the divine good. And this insight of Plato's is developed in Christian thought, especially in St. Augustine, and then in St. Thomas. And St. Thomas Aquinas synthesizes this Platonic teaching with the teaching on the common good that you find in Aristotle, in Plato's greatest disciple, and the primacy of the common good. But let's pause for a moment at this text of Plato's. Notice the importance of order in what he says. He talks about looking at the eternal truths and seeing there an order, a reasonable order, and holding converse with this divine order, the philosopher thinking about this order. And then he tries to imitate this order in his own soul. So virtue, the order in the human soul, is a picture, as it were, an image, an imitation, a copy of an order that he finds in divine things. So he becomes orderly and divine as far as the nature of man allows. And then he says, and if such a philosopher is put in charge of ordering other people's souls, of educating young men, or of educating the state through formulating law, which is what educates the state, then he will design it to imitate this heavenly pattern, this heavenly order. Okay. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches that order is the good which God principally intended when he created the world. When God created the world, he created every created thing to reflect some aspect of the divine glory, the divine beauty. But the order of all, the beautiful harmony that results from the order of all the different creatures, that unites the whole creation into one beautiful work of art, that order is the best thing in creation. And that's what God principally intends. So St. Thomas says, this is why God, in the first creation account in Genesis, after creating each kind of thing, it says, and God saw that it was good, but only at the end, on the sixth day, when he's created everything, he looks at all his works and he saw that they were very good. So this very, says St. Thomas, means that the order of the whole is what's best in creation. Quotation from St. Thomas, quote, "The multitude and distinction of things has been planned by the divine mind and has been instituted in the real world so that created things would represent the divine goodness in various ways, and diverse beings would participate in it in different degrees, so that out of the order of diverse beings, a certain beauty would arise in things." So this beauty is what God principally intends. This beauty consists in order. Beatrice says exactly the same thing at the beginning of Dante's Paradiso. She says, "All things, whate'er they be, have order among themselves, and this is the form that makes the universe resemble God. Le cose tutte quante hanno ordine tra loro, e questo è forma che l'universo a Dio fa somigliante." The great Thomist Charles de Koning, a Canadian commentator on St. Thomas, says, well, actually Belgian, but he lived in Canada, says, calls this order the good of the universe, and he calls it God's manifestation of himself outside himself. And the human person is kind of a microcosm of this whole created order. The human person, which combines, man who combines in himself the material and the spiritual, can be a kind of a model of this whole created order. And this is why virtue can be identified with happiness, because virtue is my participation in the best good that there is in creation, in this best thing, this greatest order that makes the world similar to God. And virtue, therefore, makes me similar to God, as Plato says. It makes him divine as far as possible for human nature. And the order in a city, in a community, in a state, is an even greater participation in that order than the order in an individual man. Augustine talks about this a lot. He comments on the idea of peace in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms. "If I forget you, O city of peace," says the psalmist, "let my right hand wither, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem, the city of peace, above my highest joy." So Augustine says the peace of the whole city of Jerusalem, or then of the whole church, as he puts it later, is a greater good for me than the peace of my own soul, than the order in my own soul. Peace, Augustine defines as tranquility of order, so it's another word for this order that we're talking about. And this is also how Thomas Aquinas understands Aristotle's teaching on the common good. So Aristotle says at the beginning of the Ethics, a famous text, quote, "Even if the end here meaning the purpose, the telos, even if the end is the same for a single man and for a state, that of the state seems at all events something greater and more complete, whether to attain or to preserve. Though it is worthwhile to attain the end merely for one man, it is finer and more godlike, more divine, Dios, to attain it for a nation or for city-states. So it is good for man to realize this order of creation in his own soul, but it is more godlike for him to realize it in the community, in the state. And St. Thomas takes this more godlike of Aristotle very literally. The state reflects God more than the individual man, just as the whole universe reflects God more than any individual creature. So recall what I said about participation a moment ago. My own good exists more in the divine than in my own individual existence, because my own individual existence is a participation, it's a partial sharing. And from this we can draw a corollary now about the state, the common good of the state or of the city, the order of the community, is more my good than any private good of mine. The common good of order or peace in the state is common in the fullest sense of the word common. That is, all the members, all the subjects of the kingdom share in the peace of the kingdom without that peace being divided or lessened by its being shared. That's St. Thomas's definition of a common good, that it's not lessened by being shared. So the common good, according to this philosophy, is not what it's often thought of today as something useful, as the conditions which enable individuals to get what they want. But the common good is itself something good. It's greater than any individual's, the purely individual good. It's better, it's the best good that human beings can make themselves. It's where they find their happiness more than in any individual good. Okay, so we've got this conception of politics, beginning with the Greeks, developed by Augustine and St. Thomas, that sees man as having an objective good. This good is a participation in the divine good. It consists principally in the unity of order, this beautiful harmony. And this unity of order exists in the individual soul through virtue and in the community through peace. And law is ordered to producing this unity of order, both in the individual soul and, even more importantly, in the community as a whole. So St. Thomas defines the law as follows, quote, "Law is an ordinance of reason for the common good, made by him who has care of the community and promulgated." So law derives its legitimacy from the good to which it is ordered, from the fact that it's ordered to the authentic good. If it is ordered to the true common good, then it is binding on all its subjects, not in a way that enslaves them, as we saw with Demaratus and Xerxes, but in a way that makes them free, right? That allows them to reach what they really want, what's really good. Similarly, the ruler, who makes the law and administers the law, has his authority from the common good. To the extent that the ruler serves the authentic common good, he has legitimate authority, and he is not imposing on anyone. So legitimacy on this classical view does not depend on the consent of the governed, as it does in modern political philosophy, on the people consenting to the authority. It doesn't depend on democratic legitimation processes, but it depends on the objectivity of the good. Okay, so that's so much about the purpose of government, according to this view. Now let's look at the form of government, which follows from its purpose. So once we've seen the principles that I've laid out, this is very briefly, it's easy to see why many of the great medieval thinkers thought that the best form of government was monarchy. Since government is for the sake of the common good, and the common good consists in a kind of unity, namely the unity of order that reflects the divine beauty, the primary purpose of government is to produce unity. So St. Thomas argues in his book on kingship to the King of Cyprus, one of his minor works, that monarchy is the best form of government because that is better able to cause unity, which is itself one. So the best form of government is a form where one rules, where there's a monarch. That's the definition of monarchy, having one ruler. But of course, there are different kinds of monarchy. There have been different forms of monarchy throughout history. And the kind that St. Thomas favors is not a pure monarchy, but it's one that integrates elements of other forms of government into it, where the monarchical element is dominant, but where there are elements of aristocracy, where the few rule, and elements of democracy, where the many participate in rule. This helps to preserve the monarch from falling into tyranny, which is the worst form of government. A monarchy is a form of government where one rules for the sake of the common good. And a tyranny is where one rules for the sake of his own private advantage. And the monarchy is the best form of government, tyranny is the worst. So to keep it from falling into tyranny, it's useful to integrate aristocratic and democratic elements. St. Thomas, in the Summa Theologiae, proposes a way of integrating them by having an aristocracy that's elected by the people and from the people. But here I have to disagree with the Angelic Doctor. So most people, as Pope Pius VI noted in the text that I read from him, are ruled by passion. And it acquires a good education in virtue to give people a sense of responsibility and a devotion to the common good. And experience teaches us, as you surely all know, that a hereditary aristocracy in which the members are raised with a sense of responsibility and noblesse oblige is better able to bring to the fore such a virtuous elite than a system where the aristocratic element is elected by popular election, which tends to bring ambitious liars to the top, as we know from experience. So a great commentator on St. Thomas, who also disagrees with him on this point, is the French Dominican Garrigou-Lagrange, who says the following. This is a quote from Garrigou-Lagrange, one of the greatest Thomists of the last century. Any regime, he says, which favors the ambition of demagogues, which flatter the people in order to arrive at power, leads to political Pharisaism and to ruin, for there is no durable union except in truth and justice. And so Lagrange proposes another way of including the aristocratic and democratic elements in a monarchy, and he proposes the model of medieval France. Lagrange is a Frenchman, of course. So, another quote from Lagrange. Under the Ancien Régime in France, the interests of the different classes of society and of the different regions were represented by the corporations and their delegates, by the provincial estates, and by the estates general, which was the assembly of the clergy, the first estate, the nobility, the second estate, and of the third estate, namely the people. So the prevention of the rise of ambitious demagogues is also one of the reasons why I think that hereditary monarchy is superior to elected monarchy. So I think not only should you have a hereditary aristocracy, but also a hereditary monarch. So unlike the Polish system where you had a hereditary aristocracy but an elected monarch, and like the French system where you had both a hereditary aristocracy and a hereditary monarch. And another reason why I think that election of the monarch is a bad idea, and it should be a hereditary monarch, is that elections tend to cause faction. They tend to cause disunity in the people. They weaken their unity, and they cause enmity between the supporters of rival candidates. So that when the guy who eventually wins, half of the country is angry at him. And this is a grave disadvantage if you have the vision of politics that I've been arguing for, because the monarch ought to instantiate the unity of the community, which is the best good of the community. So a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas. Since love looks to the good, and there is a diversity of love according as there is a diversity of good, there is, however, a certain good proper to each man, considered as one person, and as far as loving this good is concerned, each one is the principal object of his own love. So I'm the principal object of the love of my own good, my own personal good, private good. But there is a certain common good, which pertains to this man or that man, insofar as he is considered as part of a whole. So the common good is my personal good, but my personal good insofar as I'm a part of the whole community. Thus, there is a certain common good pertaining to a soldier, considered as part of the army, or to a citizen as part of the state. And here comes the essential point. As far as loving this common good is concerned, the principal object of love is that in which the good primarily exists, just as the good of the army is in the general, or the good of the state is in the king. Whence, it is the duty of a good soldier that he neglects even his own safety in order to save the good of his general. So you see, the good of this unity of order in the state is sort of concretized and instantiated in the ruler. And so this is a reason why it's best for the ruler to be hereditary, because then everyone identifies with him. He's not, as it were, the favorite of one party, and everyone else is angry at him, and they hope that he loses the next election, and their guy gets in. But everyone has devotion to him. And you see this in accounts of the good old days when there were monarchs. So, for example, here I have a quote from a great French statesman, from Robert Schuman, the founder of the European Union, who was foreign minister of France when he founded the European Union and was then prime minister of France in the Fourth Republic. But he talks about how his love of politics was aroused, and it was when he was living in Luxembourg as a child, and he saw the Grand Duke. Quote now from Robert Schuman. "It is in Luxembourg that I acquired the first notions of patriotism. It was in 1890, under the Grand Ducal balcony. The people acclaimed Grand Duke Adolf, who came to make his solemn entry into the capital. I was a little boy of 4 years old, lost in the crowd. I was inflamed by its enthusiasm and taken up in its pride. Henceforth I knew what it is to love one's country, and the attachment to the sovereign, to the ruler, in this case the Grand Duke, the attachment to the sovereign who personifies and guarantees the unity, continuity, and independence of the nation." That's from Robert Schuman, the great Republican politician. So this function of the monarch is better fulfilled if he's the descendant of the kings for whom my ancestors shed their blood than if he's just, some guy elected by a party that I don't even belong to. There's an obvious objection to hereditary monarchy, to a hereditary system, and that it often results in incompetent fools being the kings of countries, right? And this is a terrible disadvantage of the hereditary system. But it's not a disadvantage of this system as opposed to other systems, right? If you look at the track record of democratic elections, you get a lot of fools and villains elected. There's a great, actually kind of crazy libertarian philosopher called Hans Hermann Hoppe, who wrote a book called Democracy, the God That Failed, which is in its positive thesis, it's a silly book, but in its critique of democracy, it's very clever. And he goes through lots of historical examples and sort of compares how many idiots and villains you have in hereditary monarchies with how many you have in democratic systems, and he says monarchies win. So Adolf Hitler is of course, the result of a democratic election and not a hereditary monarch, and so on. Okay. So now I'm turned to the second part of my paper, namely how this conception of politics has changed in the modern world. Why it is that now it seems to most people totally obvious that democracy is the best form of government. And I'll just be able to give a few hints here because this is an extremely complex process. It's the genesis of modernity. One way of stating what happened is that freedom was disengaged from the good. So modern thought, the first stirrings of which you see already in the late Middle Ages in the nominalists and voluntarists, and then you see more fully developed in Renaissance humanism, and then the full doctrine comes with the Enlightenment, begins to see freedom in a different way from the way that Plato and Aristotle and Herodotus saw it. Freedom is not seen as slavery to the law, as submission to the rule of reason, but freedom is seen as essentially deciding for yourself what to do, without being determined by anything else, not even by the objective good. Freedom is seen not as a response to what's objectively good, but as an arbitrary choice, at least in the most radical of these thinkers. You get gradations, but this is sort of the tendency of modern thought. So you have, in Pico della Mirandola, for example, the Renaissance humanist, he sort of goes back and forth between the different notions of freedom. But you see already beginning this new notion of freedom. And Pico sees man's dignity as being rooted in this indeterminacy, in the fact that he can make himself whatever he wants. He can choose what is his final end. That's what he thinks gives dignity to man. So man's dignity doesn't come, as St. Thomas thought, from understanding what's really good and being able to participate in it, but it comes rather from being able to choose whatever the heck you want. So freedom is then, what becomes important for freedom is freedom from any interference with my choice. So no one is forcing me to do something according to their vision of the good, but I'm able to, develop my own personality, do what I think is good for me, and so on. So after the wars of religion that followed the Reformation, this view of freedom is helped by another, less radical view of freedom, but that sort of joins with it to bring about the modern idea of politics. The less radical version, which we can call sort of soft liberalism, we can call the radical liberalism and the less radical soft liberalism. Soft liberalism's view is that the objective good exists for men, but it's hard to know what it is. And because people have different ideas of what it is, they fight, and the Protestants kill the Catholics, and the Catholics kill the Protestants, and it's a disaster, and no one is happy. So we should stop arguing about what the highest good is, and we should try to limit the influence of law and of politics, so that the purpose of politics becomes just sort of achieving a bare minimum of peace, so that we live together without killing each other, and everyone is allowed to follow their own idea of what the good for man is, as long as they don't do violence to anyone else. Right? This is kind of the soft version. But this joins with the hardcore version of liberalism that thinks that there is no objective good, and the dignity of man is just to choose whatever he thinks is good for himself. And together they form the modern idea of politics. And the end of politics under this conception becomes protecting rights, right? The right of each person to pursue their own conception of the good. So law is not about educating people in virtue. It's not about ordering the community towards the true good, producing the order of creation in the community and in the souls of the citizens, but it becomes about protecting the citizens' rights so that they can choose whatever it is they think their happiness lies in, whether they're right or wrong. In the early modern thinkers, such as Hobbes in England, this view of politics is used to support a new conception of monarchy, a corrupt form of monarchy, the absolute monarchy of the 17th and the 18th century, where the function of the monarch is not to be a principle of a beautiful harmony, of the order of peace in society, but the function of the monarch is to be sort of the manager of a huge bureaucratic machine that's set up to regulate things so that everyone is safe and there's no interference between the parts. And especially that everyone can amass a huge amount of wealth. The economic function, as it were, of the ruler takes on a new importance at this time. But later thinkers then realized that the machine can run without the manager. It can run automatically. And so then you get, in later liberal thinkers after Hobbes, the idea that democracy is the best system. You can set up a kind of mechanical system with a balance of power, that with a bureaucratic machinery that runs smoothly and ensures that everyone has their rights and is able to get whatever they want and prosper and so on. And this view corresponds to a new cosmology. I know I'm almost done. No worries. A new view of nature. So this is the time when you have the so-called scientific revolution. And I think that this new view of nature that comes about in the scientific revolution is what makes the new view of politics plausible to people. Why they don't think it's a silly idea is because it fits with the new view of the world that comes about through modern natural philosophy. And it's the spectacular success of the scientific revolution, the huge technological progress that it ushered in, that enables it to have such a profound effect on people's mentality. So that modern philosophy becomes totally obvious to people. And the modern political philosophy that's similar to this natural philosophy becomes obvious to people. This natural philosophy is based on a decision. It's based on not on an insight into reality, but on a decision. It's based on the decision by philosophers like Francis Bacon and René Descartes to find a way of looking at nature, at the natural world, that will enable man to have power over it, to dominate it. So the ancient view of nature, of natural science, of natural philosophy, is concerned with seeing the good in nature. What is the good that nature is trying to achieve? And what is the form, what is the being of the natural things that corresponds to their internal goal, their internal end? It's a teleological view of nature. But in the new science that comes in with Bacon and Descartes and so on, these questions are irrelevant, right? The whole point is not to find the goals that are in nature itself, but to impose our own goals on nature, to dominate it. And so the new natural science brackets every aspect of nature that's not relevant to its interest. It looks only at what the measurable aspects of the natural world. And this would be fine if this was just, as it were, a limited consideration. If you say, okay, we'll have a limited consideration in which we just look at these aspects because we want to develop new technologies or whatever, that would not be a problem. But this becomes the philosophy of nature. This becomes the way of looking at the world, and it makes the world appear as a kind of lifeless machine, moved not by the attraction of the good, not by the goodness that the Creator gives to his creation, but by kind of blind forces that are defined purely mathematically. And this view of nature affects the view of human nature. So much later, in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, you see, beginning with Freud in psychology, you see a view of human nature that sees human desire as a kind of blind force. There's this, in Freud, there's this drive, that it's not elicited by any good, any objective good, it's just this force in me. And by random events of my life, it becomes trained on this object or that. I happen to want this or that because of childhood development and so on and so on. But the object of the drive is not what causes the drive, and there's no intrinsic relation between the drive and the object. So it's purely arbitrary what I want, even if almost everyone wants the same thing because we all have the same development. And of course, all of this supports an idea of politics as ordered to allowing people to pursue whatever they want, as long as it doesn't interfere with other people's equal right to pursue what they want. And so the older view of politics appears as a tyranny. The idea of law as ordering you to the good, it seems tyrannical and contrary to freedom on this new modern account. So this radical idea of separation of freedom and the good has become ever more dominant from the early modern times, and now in our time, it's extremely dominant. So the United States Supreme Court wrote in 1992 in the decision, a famous court decision, quote, this is the United States Supreme Court, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under compulsion of the state." Right? So freedom means deciding for yourself what the universe means, what you want to give, what good you want to choose to give meaning to your life, and so on. And if the state tried to, direct you toward the objective good, that would be contrary to your dignity as a person. Okay, and so in this conception, you can also see quite easily why it seems so plausible to many people that democracy is the best form of government. Democracy gives you an illusion of being involved in the making of the laws, right? So you vote and so on, and then something is decided, and then you can go along with it because you can say, well, at least my voice was heard, or whatever. There's a wonderful text about this from George Santayana, but I'm going to skip to save time. Moreover, democracy fits with this view of the world as a lifeless machine, as the theater of blind forces interacting without any purpose, without any goal, without any attraction of the good. So I quote here from a great Austrian thinker, Erich Ritter von Kuehnelt-Leddihn, who contrasts the kind of mechanical workings of democracy with the organic workings of a monarchy. He says, quote, "Monarchy is an organic form of government in which reason can harmoniously be joined with the emotions. Monarchy is not a thought-out, artificial, arithmetical form of government, like democracy, rather in the strictest sense of the word natural, proportioned to the nature of man. Begetting and birth are contrasted to poster-covered walls and nights at the computer after election battles." That's Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn. Okay, so that's enough of that. But now, is there any practical consequence to what I've just said? It's unlikely that we, which is itself unlikely, if I were able to convince all of you of my position, it's unlikely that we would be able to go out and restore the monarchy. So what practically can be done? There's a limited amount that you can do within the framework of a democratic constitutional state. So you have, for example, in France in the 1950s, you had the end of the Fourth Republic and the beginning of the Fifth Republic. The beginning of the Fifth Republic, in the Fifth Republic, the monarchical element, the presidency is emphasized and so on. They get rid of the more parliamentary system they had in the Fourth Republic. But I think those kinds of things are of secondary importance. What's really important is to return to the principles from which conclusions about political form are drawn, to try to educate ourselves in the true philosophy and in virtue, and to form communities on a small scale where true common goods can be pursued. Obviously not the political common good itself. We can't have the perfect community on the small scale, but we can have, in a small community, you can have a community of people who pursue the good, the objective common good, together, and who instantiate something of this peace, this order, this harmony that has then, as it were, an attractive effect on the rest of the culture. And also, seeing through the false self-evidence of the current consensus helps you to have a more critical attitude towards it, and not to be too craven in your respect for consensus values and for the democratic process and so on. So what I did was I entered a monastery, because a monastery is a little community that's all about realizing this ideal of order as a participation in divine things. Okay. In conclusion, I want to say a word about nostalgia, because people are always accusing me of this being a nostalgic project. And you say, you're nostalgic for this idealized version of the Middle Ages that never really existed, and blah, blah, blah. And it's considered, kind of childish to yearn for the good old days and so on, and to be unserious and, all those kind of things. And this, I'm just going to totally oppose this idea that nostalgia is something bad and childish. Nostalgia is good. Nostalgia is what makes us human. All the great poets are nostalgic. Look at Virgil. Virgil is full of nostalgia. Dante is all about nostalgia. Read Dante on early Florence, right? This is all about nostalgia. And now I'm going to quote from someone who's maybe not really associated with nostalgia, namely our current Pope, Pope Francis. This is something he wrote as a cardinal. Quote, I am convinced that this thought, he's talking about an Italian priest, Luigi Giussani, is profoundly human and reaches man's innermost longings. I dare say that this is the most profound and at the same time understandable phenomenology of nostalgia as a transcendental fact. There is a phenomenology of nostalgia, nostos algos, feeling called home, the experience of feeling attracted to what is most proper for us, most consistent with our being. In the context of Father Giussani's reflections, we encounter instances of a real phenomenology of nostalgia. And then, the very last thing, with this I close my talk, a quote from Pope Francis's first encyclical, Lumen Fidei, where he proposes exactly the vision that I've been defending here. I think. You listen to it and see if you agree with me. So, Pope Francis. Faith makes us appreciate the architecture of human relationships because it grasps their ultimate foundation and definitive destiny in God, in His love, and thus sheds light on the art of building. As such, it becomes a service to the common good. Faith is truly a good for everyone. It is a common good. Its light does not simply brighten the interior of the church, nor does it serve solely to build an eternal city in the hereafter. It helps us build our societies in such a way that they can journey towards a future of hope. The letter to the Hebrews offers an example in this regard when it names among the men and women of faith Samuel and David, whose faith enabled them to administer justice, Hebrews 11. This expression refers to their justice in governance, to that wisdom which brings peace to the people, 1 Samuel 12, 2 Samuel 8. The hands of faith are raised up to heaven, even as they go about building in charity a city based on relationships in which the love of God is laid as a foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture, I believe. I hope everybody can hear me. Good. Now we have some space for discussion. And let me open up with a question of mine a little bit, just to spur up a little controversy here. I would like to know your opinion about your, let's say, your image of the monarchy as compared to our let's say current Catholic Church. Let's say it's some kind of a model for an order of society, which means that it's not exactly complementary with your notion of hereditary monarchy, because it cannot be hereditary. So, but it can be a monarchy, right? What would you say could be the let's say the discussion here?
Okay, yeah, excellent, excellent question. I do indeed see the monarchy of the Church as a model for the temporal order. You see in the Old Testament, there is a hereditary priesthood. The priests are the descendants of Aaron, the son of Moses. But in the New Testament, there's not. There's no hereditary priesthood. And therefore, there's also no hereditary monarch of the church. The vicar of Christ on earth, the Pope, is not a hereditary monarch. He's the representative of a hereditary monarch, namely Christ, but he's not himself a hereditary monarch. But this has to do with the fact that the order of grace surpasses the order of nature. So that the life of the church is not natural life, which is passed on by natural generation, but the life of the church is supernatural life, which is passed on through baptism, through grace. And this is why in the church there's no hereditary monarchy, but the temporal order is about natural life in the first place. And natural life is passed on through heredity. And that's why it's most natural and most fitting in the temporal order for the monarch to be hereditary.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't expecting some kind of special, let's say, revelation, but I just wanted to know because it just sort of came. But let me invite you to join our discussion, and I would like to hear some interesting questions. If you have, please. Yes, over there, back. Okay, sorry. Please wait for the microphone to come to you, okay, before asking the question.
I'm glad to have you here, and my question is about ideas, because as we know, the ideas always precede the actions. And in the revolutionary process, you know, the philosophers and the ideologies of the modern democracy and of the revolutionary process had their ideas how to change the world prepared centuries before. So if we read the works of those people from the 17th century and so on, we actually see there what we have now. And is nostalgia enough for us to think about how to make the world a better place? Is there some kind of idea how to bring new ideas? What we would like to have in 400 years? Meaning returning back to agricultural monarchy of the 13th century is not really a program. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a key question. Is there any prospect for something similar happening with, as it were, my reactionary thought, as happened with revolutionary thought? Do I think that in 400 years we'll see hereditary monarchies again? Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we can try to spread our ideas the way that the Enlightenment philosophes spread theirs, but I'm not terribly optimistic.
Did it answer your question? Or did it try to answer your question?
My question was more like to prepare some positive ideas in this way, like not like going to the leaving the world and hoping for something better, but also thinking, okay, if we do this step and then this step and then this step, then in 400 years maybe we will have a just society.
Well, I'll read to you a quote that I didn't read from my paper, one of the ones I skipped. This is from the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, from his book After Virtue, from the end of it, where he basically despairs of taking concrete steps in the political realm and proposes the following. He says, quote, "What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. And if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we are not entirely without grounds for hope. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing us for quite some time. And it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We are waiting, not for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict."
Okay, maybe another question here. Okay.
Good evening. I have a question relating to the order you've been talking about. If I understood you correctly, you said that the state is to imitate the order that is in the outer world, and that reflects the order, the divine order, the order of the God himself. So my question goes back to the original sin, that we know that the world itself is disordered due to original sin. So how can we build up a state that's going to reflect an order if we cannot even see it correctly, because it's not there? Thank you.
Yes. Excellent question. The whole world is groaning in labor pains, as St. Paul says, waiting for the revelation of the glory of the sons of God. But note that Plato refers not first to the order of the visible world, to the material world that's implicated in the disorder of the fall, but he refers to an eternal order. And for Plato, in the Platonic scheme, this is the order of the so-called Platonic forms, or ideas, the eternal ideas. But in Christian theology, you have an idea which plays a similar role, namely the idea of the spiritual universe, the choirs of the angels. And St. Thomas Aquinas is called the angelic doctor, not only because his mind is almost as strong as an angel's, but principally because he spent so much time talking about the angelic hierarchy and the way in which it's ordered by governance and by subordination, so that the higher ranks, as it were, govern over the lower ranks, and the knowledge of God himself is given to each of the angelic intelligences. So there you have a model that is not implicated in original sin. But you're right that we are, and that's where this disorder in the soul comes from, that Plato notes, the conflict between passion and reason that's in our soul. This is an effect of original sin. And this is why it's necessary to rectify our souls through habituation to virtue. And this is why politics is necessary. This is why law is necessary, and it's why punishment is necessary. It's why you have to have a coercive authority in the state, because the establishment of this order meets with resistance from this disorder that's in us through original sin. But the model is not so much, for some of the ancients, the model you get by looking at the stars. But for St. Thomas, the model is in the spiritual universe. It's not in the visible world.
Do you have some kind of comment about this, or?
Well, my only observation is that if that's it, if the model is the spiritual world, then how can we even observe it for a natural man, right? Like, do you see a spiritual order? For me, it's pretty hard, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, read Plato. He comes remarkably close. And then after reading Plato, read St. Thomas, who has, in addition to the light of reason, the light of revelation, and you see there a remarkably rich account of that order.
Okay, thanks. Another question? Over here in the front.
And read Dante's Commedia. It's the best depiction of this image of things that I know.
Good evening. Allow me to put you a question. You did mention a quotation that democracy ought to be the best, or is considered as the best way of reigning or administration of society. I know this quotation in some another way that the democracy is not the perfect, is imperfect way of reigning, but none other had been invented by humanity. And it is attributed to Winston Churchill, but it is not really true. Before him, it was written by Reinhold Niebuhr, the moral man in immoral society. And it ought there is a book in the United States of Kozinski, which defend or argue, as you have argued here, of monarchy as a best or better way of reigning. But there is a link with natural jurisprudence. If we allow or we accept natural laws and natural jurisprudence, it ought be in such hierarchy. But the majority of societies are positive jurisprudence, and there could it be accepted by these modern societies? This is the first question. And another is, do you know Milbank radical orthodoxy, and how there is a way of thinking about the monarchy in Milbank's view?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't get the question, so I hope you did.
I think so. So the first part of the question is about the quote attributed to Winston Churchill. He's supposed to have said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all others. That's the version of it that I've heard. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all others. And the idea is that it's a way of protecting us from tyranny. But this is true in a limited way, I think. Namely, it's true if, as you say, you have a society that is not based on natural law, that doesn't recognize an objective good, but that's based on positive law, and thinks that the good is relative, it's whatever you say it is. Given that false idea of law and that false idea of the good, then maybe democracy is somewhat less dangerous than other forms of government. But the whole point of what I've been saying is that you have to change the false ideas. So I don't think that it would be a good idea to have a monarchy in a society where they had only an idea of law as positive law, and that had a sophistic account of the good. Monarchy is only good if you have a society where there's an idea of natural law, an idea of the objective good, and so on. I want to read you another quote from Garrigou-Lagrange, who says exactly the opposite of Churchill or Reinhold Niebuhr. As you say, it's actually from Reinhold Niebuhr. So this is Garrigou-Lagrange. He says, from the point of view of a disciple of St. Thomas, from this point of view, a disciple of St. Thomas liked to summarize his doctrine on the question of regime by saying, regimen perfectum in ratione regiminis, si licit monarchia, est regimen imperfectorum, dom regimen imperfectum, si licit democratia, est regimen perfectorum. Democracy is an imperfect regime, as a regime in ratione regiminis, that is, from the notion of government itself, it's less perfect than monarchy. And it could only work if all the citizens are perfect, that is, if they all have prudence and the other virtues. Whereas monarchy is the most perfect, from the theoretical view, from the ratio of regime, but it works even when the subjects are imperfect, because you only need the monarch to be virtuous. Well, not only. You need the monarch to be virtuous and a number of the other people, but you don't need the whole people to be virtuous, as you would in a democracy. And then you asked about John Milbank and radical orthodoxy. John Milbank is an Anglican theologian who I agree with on many things. He has a very stylish way of presenting the older conception of politics. But there are many points I disagree with him as well. But his book, he wrote a book called Theology and Social Theory that's very worth reading. It gives a very good account of the genesis of the modern idea of politics and how it came about and how irrational it is.
Thank you very much for the answer. Okay, so I think we are nearing to the end of this discussion block, so maybe I will have 3 more questions and then we can just close it up. Yes, here in the front.
How is it correct in monarchical system?
Yeah.
How we can provide in monarchical system that it will not be misused and will not turn up into tyranny, because monarch has all the power, so we can become a tyrant very easily.
Yeah, this is, of course, an important question, and it's part of the reason why democracy became so attractive to many thinkers in the early modern period, because you in fact had many tyrannical monarchs. The part of this solution has to do with the monarchs being bound to a higher power. So Bratislava is the city where for centuries the apostolic kings of Hungary were crowned, right? And you look at the coronation oath of the apostolic kings of Hungary, in which they bind themselves to serve the common good. And you have similar covenants that all the Christian kings of Europe made at their coronations with the coronation oath. And you had a way of enforcing it, namely, the Pope was in charge of enforcing it. So you have instances in the Middle Ages where monarchs are excommunicated by the Pope because they break their coronation oaths, because they turn tyrannical, or where their whole country is put under interdict, so that no one in their country is allowed to receive the sacraments until they repent, right? And then everyone is angry at the king, and then he says, okay, I'll handle things somewhat differently. Yeah. So it is a problem, it's true. It's a problem in every form of government, not only in monarchy. But in monarchy, as you say, there's a special risk because one person has so much power. But in the order of Christendom, the order that was at least attempted in the Christian Middle Ages, there are ways of dealing with the problem, as it were.
Okay, another question over here. In the middle. Does it work?
Hello.
Okay.
One question has to do with what you were just talking about. Is what do you think that theoretically is monarchy as the best form of government possible without Christianity? And the other question is, you were saying that one of the practical goals for us should be to basically try to create a small community within the society where we promote virtuous life, basically, and you entered the monastery. And I wanted to ask you if you have any counsel for us which stay in the middle of the world.
Okay, so to the first question, I think that monarchy is the best form of government, even in a non- or pre-Christian society that that recognizes the natural law, that recognizes the objective good. So I think it's the worst form of government in a society that doesn't recognize the natural law, but the best in one that does. But I think that it works much better in a Christian society than in a pagan society. And to the second question, I think that the Ladislav Hanos days are a very good activity to promote this. So thank you very much for organizing them.
All right, thanks. Last question.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you. Some problems with the microphone. Okay, so maybe we'll change the microphones then.
The light was on, but the voice not. I maybe a short, small follow-up to the last question actually, because I was wondering after you came with your practical solutions to your very, very nice and deep introduction, which I was really looking forward, because I like the introduction, but the question is that we live in this world and we need to know what to do tomorrow. But the dilemma of Christians maybe, because you suggested the small communities, which is also with the, in line with the social teaching of the church, which is the subsidiarity principle. So practically in the basic community, small communities, we need to, and also it's in line with being the seed and the light. But I'm just wondering if we close ourselves in these small communities, how shall we sort of focus only on our own being safe, and the whole goal of our life is to reach, to be saved, and not to, and maybe to ignore the rest of the world, or only try to help the people in the small communities, or how to balance this dilemma between being part of the society, maybe run for an office, to be involved in politics, even maybe seeing that democracy is not the right way how our society should be ruled, but we don't have the power to change it.
Activity in the world. So I think that, I admire tremendously people who enter politics with great ideals and so on, and try to work for some recognition of natural law or whatever in current politics. Slovakia has got some great members in the European Parliament whom I admire very much, who fight for the right to life and so on. And I think that's a very good and useful thing. I think that the solution of small communities, there are different forms of this as well. I think that finally there are some people who are called to a very radical separation from the world, and that this is ultimately perhaps the most fruitful, that it's what brought about the Christian Middle Ages was really Benedictine monasticism, which radically separated itself from the existing order, wasn't trying to start a new culture or a new vision of politics or anything. They were just trying to seek God. And that's ultimately what brought about the Christian Middle Ages. But I think that that's a vocation for some people and not for everyone. And I admire people who do other things as well, like your good Slovak politicians. cheers to them. Oh, and then the second question was democracy by lottery. This was the system that was used in ancient Athens and in many of the ancient Greek democracies. And Aristotle says it's the most democratic way of choosing rulers because they're chosen at random from the people, so it's really the people who rules. So I think it's not quite as good as election, because in election you at least have, well, it depends. You have, in election you have more of an aristocratic element, because what happens in an electoral democracy is that you get a certain class of people who have political influence, and they control the party system, and they get elected. And in some democracies that aren't very radically liberal, that aren't like present-day Austria, but like if you look at, say, Great Britain in the 19th century, right? You have basically the late 19th century, after the Whig reforms of the 1830s, you have basically a democracy, even though it's nominally a monarchy. But the people who are elected, they belong to kind of an aristocratic class, and one that had a certain amount of concern, a public spirit, a certain sense of the common good and so on. I think that nowadays, I mean, if in present-day Austria or in the United States, if you switch to lotteries instead of elections, it would make no difference.
All right, thank you very much for your great insights and for the lecture, Exhausted Democracy. I'm afraid we have exhausted time just now, so I'm just going to close off with two observations of mine. You spoke about small communities. I think the Hanus Fellowship is trying to be such a small community, but it's growing. So I hope that we will be on our doing everything on the way to achieve this kind of model. I'm just not sure who's going to be the monarch there, but we'll see. And the second observation, I hope you can agree that that homeschooling can produce good education, as we have heard just now. So thank you very much for your lecture again. We can give him an applause for Father Edmund.